The town of Meadowbrook had always been quiet, its streets lined with white picket fences and trees that formed a canopy over the sidewalks. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else, where people exchanged smiles at the local grocery store, and where life seemed to move at a peaceful, predictable pace. But for the Johnson family, things were never as simple as they appeared. Mia, the youngest of the Johnson family, skipped down the sidewalk, her braids bouncing with every step. She was excited. It was the first day of school, and she had a brand new pink backpack and sparkly shoes. Her brother Jamal, who was 15, walked beside her, his face the picture of teenage indifference. But Mia didn't mind. She loved her brother, even if he acted like he was too cool to care about anything these days. "Race you to the bus stop," Mia challenged, her eyes lighting up with mischief. Jamal glanced at her and shook his head, but a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "You're on," he said, and before Mia could even take a step, Jamal darted ahead, his longer legs quickly putting distance between them. Mia laughed and ran after him, her feet pounding the pavement. The bus stop was only a block away, but to Mia, it felt like a race to the stars. Jamal always let her win sometimes, though, so she wasn't worried. As they arrived at the bus stop, Mia noticed something strange. A group of kids, about her age, were standing near the bus, whispering and glancing over at her. Mia didn't understand it. They looked at her the same way they always did, like she was different, like she didn't belong. She shook off the feeling, chalking it up to nerves, and stood next to Jamal. But Jamal noticed too. He had long since learned the unspoken language of looks and whispers that followed his family around, the way people saw them, like they were some kind of puzzle to be solved. He didn't want Mia to know yet. He wanted to protect her from that. But there it was every morning, every afternoon, like a shadow that followed them wherever they went. The bus pulled up, its yellow frame gleaming in the morning sun. But before anyone could board, a woman in the front of the bus raised her hand and pointed to the Johnson family. "Sorry," she said, her voice sweet but strained. "There's no room for you. We're full." The driver, an older man with glasses, didn't even look up. Jamal opened his mouth to protest, but Mrs. Johnson, who had just arrived with a worried frown, placed a hand on his arm, shaking her head slightly. "Let's go, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. The warmth of her hand on Jamal's arm was the only thing that kept him from snapping. Mia, confused but trusting her mother, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Why didn't we get on the bus?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Johnson smiled gently, but her eyes were full of sorrow. "Sometimes people don't always know how to make room for everyone," she said, her words carrying the weight of something unspoken. As they walked away, a breeze swept through the air, but there was no coolness to it, only heat, a tension that seemed to rise with every step they took. And then, just as they were about to turn the corner, Mia noticed something, a piece of paper, pinned to the town bulletin board. The words were hastily scrawled, but unmistakable. "Go back to where you came from." Mia didn't understand it, but she felt it in her chest, like something sharp was digging into her heart. She glanced up at her mother, who stood frozen, staring at the paper as if she'd seen it before, as if it was a reminder of something long buried. Mrs. Johnson didn't say anything as they walked away, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Jamal had his jaw clenched, and even Grandma Rose, who had walked with them, seemed to be lost in her thoughts. When they got home, Mia's eyes were still on her mother, who hadn't said a word since they left the bus stop. But Mia wasn't a fool. She knew something wasn't right. Later that night, as Mia lay in bed, the quiet of the house settled over her, broken only by the sound of the wind outside. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about the words on the paper. And then she heard it, a knock on the door. Her father, Mr. Johnson, had been home for hours, but this knock was different. It was sharp, urgent. A moment later, Grandma Rose called out from the kitchen. "Mia, come down here." Mia's heart pounded in her chest. Something was happening, something big, and as she stood in the doorway, her father's voice filled the air, steady but strained. "I think it's time we talk about what's really going on here." Mia's stomach twisted. She didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of everything, and the world she knew was about to change forever. The morning sunlight filtered through the old oak trees in front of the Johnsons' house, casting dappled shadows on the sidewalk. Mia sat on the porch swing, her small hands gripping the worn wooden sides as she watched the world wake up around her. Birds sang, and the air was rich with the scent of dew and fresh grass. She liked this time of day when everything felt calm, before the shouts of school and the busy hum of town life took over. Mrs. Johnson peeked out from the kitchen window, wiping her hands on her apron. The sight of her youngest child playing brought a smile to her face, but it was a tired smile, lined with worry. Mia's laughter was a rare sound these days, and Mrs. Johnson was determined to protect that joy, even when she faced battles of her own at work. The whispers and sideways glances she endured from patients and co-workers had become as regular as the sunrise, but she couldn't let them seep into her home. "Mia, come in. Time to get ready for school," she called softly. Mia's eyes sparkled as she sprang up, but her joy was short-lived. Across the street, the Wilsons' pickup truck rumbled to life. Mr. Wilson, a tall man with a permanent scowl and rough hands, stepped out with a nod to Mr. Johnson, who was tending to the garden. Mr. Johnson responded with a polite smile that barely touched his eyes. The tension between them was palpable, but it was unspoken, buried under layers of forced civility. "Come on, Jamal," Mia shouted, running to the door. Jamal's room was upstairs, where a basketball hoop hung on the back of the door. She heard him tossing the ball against the wall, the thud echoing down the hall. "Almost done." Jamal called back, but his voice was hollow, flat. Mia waited, her excitement deflating with each second. Mr. Johnson glanced up, catching Jamal's gaze as he came down the stairs. Jamal's eyes were shadowed, his face drawn and pale. Mr. Johnson's heart tightened. Lately, Jamal had been quieter than usual, too caught up in his own thoughts. The taunts at school had grown worse, and though Mr. Johnson had tried to reassure him, the sting of each cruel word left a lasting mark. "Are you okay, son?" Mr. Johnson asked as Jamal passed by. "Yeah, Dad." "Let's go," Jamal muttered, avoiding his father's eyes. The drive to school was silent, the kind of silence that pressed in, heavy and uncomfortable. Mia, buckled in her seat, fidgeted with her backpack straps, occasionally glancing at Jamal, who sat at the window, staring out at the passing fields. Mrs. Johnson's fingers tightened on the steering wheel, a sign that she was holding back the things she longed to say. Mr. Johnson sat next to her, his jaw clenched as he navigated through the maze of suburban streets, the tension in the car like a coiled snake waiting to strike. As they reached the school, students filled the sidewalks, their chatter a cacophony that washed over them. Mia opened her door and hopped out, turning to look at Jamal. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away, a slight wince flashing across his face. Mrs. Johnson hesitated before following Mia out, glancing at the school building that loomed over them like a fortress. "Jamal, come on," she urged softly. Jamal pushed open his door, stepping out with a resigned sigh. They walked up the steps together, Mia clutching his hand tightly. But as they entered the school, the laughter around them felt sharp and stinging. A group of boys in the corner snickered as Jamal walked by, their whispers reaching him clearly. "Look at him, like he's untouchable," one of them sneered. Jamal's spine stiffened, his heart pounding, but he kept walking. The day stretched on, the classrooms a blur of lessons, glances, and whispered comments. Mia felt it too, in the hallways and on the playground. Some children stayed away from her, but others stared, eyes wide with curiosity or mischief. She noticed the teacher, Mrs. Phelps, who always looked at her with an uncomfortable smile, her voice more clipped than kind. At lunch, Mia sat with a small group of kids who whispered secrets and traded snacks. It was here that she felt safe, a tiny island in a sea of uncertainty. But the laughter of a group of girls at the next table stung, their chatter turning into pointed remarks. "You see Mia's hair? Looks like she's wearing a bird's nest," One of them giggled. Mia blinked, her mouth tightening, and she glanced at Jamal. He sat hunched, pushing his food around with a fork. He caught her eyes and shook his head, a tiny, silent plea not to let it get to her. But it was too late. The words were already lodged in her mind, and they hurt. After school, the family gathered in the kitchen. Mrs. Johnson prepared a quick snack, her hands moving automatically as she watched Jamal's sullen face and Mia's sudden silence. Mr. Johnson leaned against the doorway, his expression pained. "Did anything happen today?" he asked carefully. Jamal looked up, eyes fierce and tired. "Nothing that matters." Mrs. Johnson set a plate of cookies on the table, the sweet scent mingling with the tension in the room. The family sat together, the weight of unspoken truths pressing on their shoulders. They knew it was only a matter of time before they had to confront the community, the school, and the people who hid behind their own prejudices. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. It was loud, urgent, and sent a jolt through the room. Mr. Johnson stood up, exchanging a glance with Mrs. Johnson that spoke of too many things: fear, dread, and the unknown. He opened the door, and there stood Mr. Wilson, his face pale, his eyes wide. The air grew colder, and Mia's heart thumped as she watched the man who had always been a silent thorn in their side. "Mr. Johnson," Mr. Wilson said, voice gravelly. "We need to talk. Now?" Mr. Johnson's expression hardened, but he nodded. The rest of the family watched, confusion and unease swirling like storm clouds as Mr. Wilson stepped inside. "What is it?" Mrs. Johnson whispered. Mr. Wilson looked past her, into the darkening room where the weight of secrets seemed ready to spill. "Something happened today. Something that could change everything." The room fell silent, but the air buzzed with the electric pulse of dread. Mr. Wilson's presence filled the room like a shadow, dark and unrelenting. The Johnsons exchanged uneasy glances, each face etched with worry and confusion. Mrs. Johnson's fingers trembled as she reached for the edge of the counter, while Mia and Jamal stood a few feet away, their eyes locked on the man they'd come to know as a distant, disapproving figure. Mr. Wilson's eyes were red-rimmed, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. He stepped forward, the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his boots breaking the silence. "It's about Jamal," Mr. Wilson said, his voice low and strained. "There's been an incident at school." Jamal's breath caught in his throat, and Mia's hands clenched at her sides. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "What happened?" His voice was a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the room tighten. Mr. Wilson looked at Mr. Johnson, then at Jamal. "It was in the gym. A group of boys. They were playing basketball. It started as a joke, but then," he hesitated, the words hanging in the air like a sharp, unshed tear. Jamal's eyes widened, a flash of panic crossing his face. "What did they do?" His voice trembled, but it was fierce, demanding an answer. "They cornered him," Mr. Wilson said, his voice breaking. "They started pushing him around, calling him names. And when he fought back..." Mia gasped. "Jamal, did you..." Jamal shook his head quickly, his dark eyes glistening. "No, I just pushed back, that's all. I didn't start anything." Mr. Johnson stepped forward, his jaw tightening. "Is he okay?" he asked, the fear in his voice palpable. "He's in the principal's office now," Mr. Wilson said. "They called me because of what happened next." Mrs. Johnson's heart raced as she realized the weight of the conversation. "What happened next?" she whispered, bracing herself for what was to come. "They say Jamal hit one of the boys in the face," Mr. Wilson said. "The boy, Sam, has a bruise. It's bad. But that's not all." Mia clutched Jamal's hand, her small fingers trembling. Jamal squeezed her back, but he wouldn't look up. He was staring at the floor, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. "Jamal's not that kind of person," Mr. Johnson said, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was sharp, steadying. "He wouldn't do that unless he had to." Mr. Wilson nodded, but the sadness in his eyes deepened. "I know, but they're saying it was a fight. And now, Jamal could be suspended. The room fell silent. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for someone to speak. Mrs. Johnson felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "We need to go to the school," Mr. Johnson said, his voice steady now, the resolve in it giving everyone pause. Now, the school office was a sterile, cold space, filled with the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of cleaning supplies. Mrs. Johnson sat on a plastic chair, her fingers twisted together as she listened to the principal, Mrs. Carver, explain the situation. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, we understand this is difficult, but the fact remains that Jamal was involved in an altercation," Mrs. Carver said, her tone clinical and detached. "We have to follow school policy." Mr. Johnson's fists clenched, his jaw tight, as he fought to stay calm. Jamal was defending himself. He didn't start it. The principal's eyes softened, just for a moment. "I'm sure he didn't. But Sam's parents are demanding consequences. They say Jamal's actions were unprovoked." Mrs. Johnson's voice was hoarse, as if the air had been stolen from her. "Unprovoked. You saw the witnesses. You know what they said." Mrs. Carver's gaze flicked to the hallway, as if searching for something she couldn't name. "This isn't just about today. There have been complaints, reports of harassment, bullying." Mia's heart thudded as she glanced at Jamal, who sat with his head down, staring at his hands. His eyes were red, and the small bruise on his lip was already beginning to swell. "It's not fair," Mia whispered. "Why is this happening to him?" Mr. Johnson pulled her into his arms, his voice low as he spoke. "We'll make sure everyone knows the truth, Mia, no matter what it takes." The ride home was silent, heavier than before. Jamal sat in the back seat, staring out the window, his thoughts lost in the blur of passing trees and houses. Mia kept casting glances at him, the weight of the day's events pressing into her chest like a vice. When they arrived home, the sky was painted in shades of purple and orange, the sun dipping below the horizon as if trying to escape the scene it had watched unfold. Mr. Johnson pulled Jamal into a hug as soon as they stepped inside. "We'll fix this, son. You hear me? We'll fix this." Jamal nodded slowly, but his eyes spoke a different truth. The weight of the school's judgment, the accusations, and the stares had left a scar. And deep down, he wondered if the damage had already been done. Mia sat on the steps, looking out at the sky that was now a dark canvas dotted with stars. It had been an ordinary day turned upside down. And though she didn't know what the next day would bring, she knew one thing for sure. The battle had just begun. The next morning, the air in the Johnson household felt thick and heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Jamal sat at the kitchen table, eyes hollow, staring at the untouched plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. Mrs. Johnson moved around the kitchen, her hands busy but her mind elsewhere. Mr. Johnson stood by the window, glancing out at the quiet street, waiting for the phone to ring. Mia, dressed in her school uniform, hesitated by the front door. She wanted to ask Jamal if he was okay, but the question felt small and meaningless. She couldn't imagine what he was going through, but she knew he needed her strength, even if he couldn't admit it. "Are you sure you don't want me to drive you to school?" Mr. Johnson finally broke the silence, his voice tight with concern. Jamal looked up, shaking his head slowly. "I'm fine, Dad. I'll walk." Mr. Johnson's eyes softened, but he said nothing more. They all knew that Jamal didn't want to face the whispers, the knowing glances, or the judgment that awaited him at school. But walking alone through the morning mist would be worse. It would give him too much time to think. "Jamal, I'll walk with you," Mia said, her voice steady and determined. "We'll go together." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he nodded. A small, grateful smile crossed his face, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it came. They left the house in silence, the air between them full of unspoken words. The schoolyard was different now. Where once there had been laughter and the carefree noise of students, there was now a tense silence, punctuated by whispers that stopped when Jamal walked past. Mia's stomach twisted as she felt the eyes on her brother, the weight of suspicion and judgment pressing down on him like a heavy coat. "Jamal," came a voice from behind. It was Sam, the boy with the bruised cheek. He stood with a group of friends, arms crossed over his chest. His eyes were cold and guarded. "We need to talk." Jamal's body stiffened, but he forced himself to turn around. "About what?" His voice was low, but it carried a challenge that made Sam's eyes narrow. "About what happened yesterday," Sam said, stepping forward. "Everyone's saying you started it." Mia's jaw clenched as she watched the scene unfold. She knew the truth, but Sam didn't. He had been part of the crowd, part of the group that turned their backs the moment things got heated. "I didn't start it," Jamal said, his voice barely a whisper, but there was a tremor to it. "I was defending myself." "Maybe. But nobody believes you," Sam said, almost as if he regretted the words but couldn't stop himself. The tension in the air crackled like electricity. Mia opened her mouth to speak, but Jamal shook his head slightly, telling her to stay silent. His eyes met Sam's, a look of defiance mingled with the pain of being misunderstood. "Go on, Jamal," Sam said with a sharp edge to his voice. "Keep playing the hero." Mia took a deep breath, feeling the urge to push Sam away, to scream that he didn't know what he was talking about. But before she could, the warning bell rang, cutting through the air and breaking the moment like a slap. Sam turned and walked away, his friends trailing behind him, leaving Jamal and Mia in a suffocating silence. "Let's get to class," Jamal said, his voice hoarse. They walked away, their footsteps echoing against the school building, but the weight of the encounter clung to them, a dark shadow that refused to dissipate. The rest of the day was a blur for Jamal. Every glance, every whispered comment, felt like a blow, chipping away at the strength he had tried to build. He spent each class with his head down, pretending not to notice the way people avoided him or cast sidelong looks in his direction. It was only during lunch, as he sat with Mia in the corner of the cafeteria, that he felt a flicker of hope. The world seemed a little quieter there, just the two of them in their corner. They didn't talk much, but the comfort of being together was enough. "Jamal," came a soft voice. It was Alex, one of the few friends who hadn't turned away. "Can I sit?" Jamal looked up, surprised. He nodded, and Alex took a seat across from him, his expression serious. "I heard what happened," Alex said, glancing around nervously as if afraid someone might overhear. "I know it's not your fault. I know you're not that guy." Jamal's heart tightened at the words. For the first time, in what felt like forever, he felt a warmth spread through him. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Thanks, Alex," Jamal said, his voice rough. Alex smiled, a small, genuine smile that spoke more than words ever could. "You're not alone, man. Not everyone believes what they're saying." Jamal nodded, the weight on his chest lessening just a bit. He looked at Mia, who sat watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But as the final bell rang and the students flooded out of the cafeteria, the fear settled back in. The real storm hadn't hit yet. The hearing, the judgment, the decisions, it was all coming, and Jamal wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. But with Mia by his side, and friends who believed in him, maybe he could find a way to survive it. The days following the confrontation were a blur. Each morning, Jamal trudged to school, his steps heavier with every passing day. The halls, once filled with light and laughter, now seemed like a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Mia was the only constant, always there, her presence a balm to his frayed nerves. The rumors had spread beyond the school. What had started as a fight in a playground had snowballed into a story that took on a life of its own. Teachers spoke in hushed voices when they thought Jamal wasn't listening. Parents whispered at the grocery store, eyes darting toward him when they thought he couldn't see. It was as if his very name had become a curse, a label that no amount of explanation could erase. One afternoon, Mr. Johnson sat in the living room, newspaper in hand, the crinkling of the pages loud in the otherwise silent room. The headlines were harsh, their bold print glaring like a spotlight. A report about the school incident had made the local news, and the story had been twisted into a version Jamal didn't recognize. "Jamal," Mr. Johnson called, his voice tight. "Come here." Jamal hesitated, then slowly made his way to the living room. He stood in the doorway, feeling exposed, as if the world had suddenly turned its gaze upon him. "Look at this," his father said, pointing at the headline. "Violence at Lincoln High. Troubled teen escapes blame." Jamal's chest tightened. He couldn't bear to read the words, but he could already feel them etching themselves into his memory, branding him as something he wasn't. "I'm sorry, Dad," Jamal whispered, eyes cast down. Mr. Johnson's face softened. He put the paper down and stood up. "Son, we'll get through this. You hear me? We'll fight it, and we'll win." Jamal nodded, but the doubt in his eyes spoke louder than any words. The truth felt like a fragile thread, ready to snap under the weight of lies. The next day, Jamal faced the biggest test yet. The principal, Mr. Lee, called him into his office. The room was cold, the walls lined with certificates and photos of school achievements that now felt empty and meaningless. Mr. Lee sat behind a desk that seemed twice as wide as it needed to be, his face stern, but his eyes searching, as if looking for something Jamal couldn't name. "Jamal," Mr. Lee began, "I need you to be honest with me. What happened on Tuesday?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Jamal's palms began to sweat, his heart racing. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. Mia's words from the day before echoed in his mind. "You're not alone. Not everyone believes what they're saying." He drew a shaky breath and finally spoke. "I told the truth, Mr. Lee. I was just defending myself." The principal's eyes met his, searching, trying to gauge the sincerity in Jamal's voice. After a moment, he leaned back in his chair. "The other students say differently. They claim you provoked the fight." "I didn't," Jamal said, the words fierce now, fueled by the frustration that had built up over the past few days. "I never started anything. I was pushed." Mr. Lee sighed, the disappointment clear in his posture. "I'm going to need more than your word, Jamal. I need witnesses, statements." The room seemed to tilt, the noise of the world outside the walls fading into a dull hum. Jamal's mind spun, looking for a way out. But there was no way out. Not now. Not when the whole school seemed to be watching, waiting for the verdict. "I'll find them," Jamal said, more to himself than to the principal. Mr. Lee nodded. "Do what you need to, Jamal. But remember, we're not just looking for what happened. We're looking for the truth." As Jamal left the office, the weight of those words followed him. The truth. But whose truth? And who would believe it? Mia found Jamal in the library after school. He sat alone at a table, head bowed over a stack of papers. He looked up as she approached, eyes tired but determined. "Hey," she said, taking the seat across from him. "Did you talk to Mr. Lee?" Jamal nodded, the movement small and reluctant. "He needs more proof." Mia frowned. "Proof? But there's nothing to prove. You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Jamal said, voice cracking. "But it's not enough, Mia. They want to hear it from someone else. They want someone to stand up and say, 'I didn't start it.'" "Then let's find someone," Mia said, her voice fierce. "We can't let them do this to you." Jamal's eyes brightened at the promise in her voice. He nodded, a spark of hope flickering in the darkness. They would fight this, together. No matter what it took, they'd find a way to make the truth known. As the sky outside grew darker, the storm clouds still hung heavy in the air, but now there was a small, defiant light in the heart of the storm. It was a glimmer, fragile yet fierce, and it belonged to Jamal and Mia, a promise that the fight for the truth wasn't over. The next few days were a whirlwind. Jamal and Mia met after school, poring over notes and trying to piece together a list of names. They approached classmates who had been there when the fight started, hoping for support, but the responses were mixed. Some looked away, afraid to get involved. Others, like Tony Rivera, the captain of the basketball team, seemed hesitant at first, but eventually agreed to speak. "Listen, man," Tony said during a lunch break, his voice low. "I don't want any trouble, but if you're sure about this, I'll tell them what I saw." "Thank you, Tony," Jamal said, the weight in his chest easing slightly. The small victories felt like beacons in a dark sea. However, word spread fast, and soon the whispers turned into open discussions. Some of the kids in the hallways who'd previously ignored Jamal began to murmur about his side of the story. A few of them even started nodding when they heard him speak, a silent show of solidarity. But Jamal knew it wasn't enough. It would take more than a handful of voices to change the tide. The next day, Mia suggested they reach out to Ms. Anderson, the school counselor who was known for her fairness and no-nonsense attitude. She agreed to meet them after school in her office, a small room with bookshelves that smelled of old paper and a window that overlooked the soccer field. "Tell me what happened," she said, giving Jamal her full attention. The gentle concern in her eyes was a relief, a break from the cold stares he'd grown used to. Jamal recounted the events again, his voice a little steadier now. Mia spoke up, adding details about the conversations they'd had and the witnesses they'd gathered. Ms. Anderson nodded. "This doesn't add up, Jamal. I believe you. But we need to get statements, and we need to make sure the school administration knows that students are standing by you. If we're going to clear this up, we need more than just your word." The plan was set in motion. Mia worked on getting more students to come forward, some who had kept quiet before out of fear or doubt. She even convinced Jasmine Patel, the editor of the school newspaper, to write a piece about the incident, sharing perspectives from those who had been there. It was risky, but Jasmine was known for standing up for what she believed in. Meanwhile, Jamal met with Tony and a few others to prepare their statements, practicing what they'd say in front of Mr. Lee and the rest of the school's administration. It was exhausting, but for the first time since the fight, Jamal felt a flicker of hope. A week later, Mr. Lee called Jamal to his office again. This time, he wasn't alone. Mia sat beside him, a determined look on her face. Tony was there too, along with Jasmine and a few other students, all standing in a circle that seemed to give Jamal strength. Mr. Lee's eyes moved over the group. He glanced at Jamal, then at the others, before taking a seat behind his desk. The room felt different this time. There was a tense anticipation in the air, as if the weight of what was about to happen could change everything. "Jamal," Mr. Lee began, looking at him with a mixture of concern and curiosity, "I understand there's more to this story than we initially thought." Jamal's heart pounded. He glanced at Mia, who gave him a quick nod, and then at Tony, who looked as if he were ready for a battle. Jasmine sat with her notebook, ready to document whatever was about to unfold. The voices that spoke were clear and firm, recounting the details of what had really happened that day, the moments before, during, and after the fight. They told Mr. Lee and the rest of the school that Jamal hadn't started it, that he had defended himself, and that the other boy, Chris, had pushed him too far. Ms. Anderson had been right. The truth was stronger than the rumors. With each statement, Jamal felt the heavy weight in his chest begin to lift, replaced by a hope that felt real, solid. When the last voice finished, Mr. Lee leaned forward, his eyes softening. "I believe you," he said quietly. The words were like a key turning in a lock, opening doors that had been shut tight. Jamal felt a rush of relief wash over him. He looked around at his friends, who smiled back at him with a mix of pride and exhaustion. It wasn't over yet, but the hardest part was behind them. The truth had been heard, and it had been enough. The next day, Jamal walked into school with his head held high. There were still glances and whispers, but now there was a different tone to them. The world felt less heavy, less impossible. He didn't have to fight alone anymore. As he passed Mia in the hallway, she gave him a thumbs up. Tony nodded, and Jasmine's smile was warm as she caught his eye. He had allies now, voices that made sure his side of the story was told. And that was enough to keep moving forward. The storm hadn't passed, but for the first time, Jamal felt like he could weather it. The school year seemed to shift the day after Jamal's statements were heard. The days of whispers turned into conversations, and the conversations began to change the atmosphere at the school. While some kids continued to avoid Jamal, others came forward, curious and supportive. The teachers seemed to notice the change too, their eyes softening when they passed Jamal in the halls, as if they had remembered the importance of listening. Jamal felt like he was standing at the edge of something new. He was no longer just the kid who kept his head down. People knew him now for more than the whispers or the fight. They knew him for speaking up, for facing the hardest truth of his life, and for the friends who stood with him. One day, during lunch, Mia brought up an idea. "We should do something positive," she said, glancing at Jamal. "Something that reminds everyone we're not just defined by one moment." Jamal nodded slowly. "Like what?" Mia's eyes lit up. "A school event. A rally. Something that brings people together. So we're not just looking at each other as those kids from that fight." Tony, who was sitting across from them, spoke up. "You know, we could use some real team spirit around here. I think it's a great idea." It wasn't long before word spread. A week later, the entire school came together for a peaceful rally in the courtyard. There were posters, chants, and even a group of students who performed a song they had written about resilience and unity. Jamal stood at the edge, watching it all unfold, his chest swelling with pride. "Hey, Jamal," Jasmine called from the middle of the crowd, waving him over. He walked to where she stood, surrounded by other students who had all played a part in organizing the event. "Look at this," she said, beaming. "Everyone's here for a reason." It was true. Some of the students who had ignored Jamal in the past were clapping along, cheering with smiles that seemed to say they were ready to be better. There was a sense of community that Jamal hadn't felt before. He glanced at Mia and Tony, who were dancing along to the beat. It was as if the whole school had decided, in that moment, that they would move forward together. As the day ended, Jamal found himself on the soccer field. It was quiet now, the echo of the rally fading into the breeze. He sat down on the grass, his hands resting behind him. Mia joined him, sitting cross-legged. "You did it," she said softly. Jamal smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting. "We did it," he corrected her. Mia laughed, a sound that felt like the end of a storm. "Yeah, we did." For the first time in weeks, Jamal felt light. It wasn't that everything was perfect now, but there was a sense of hope that had been missing before. The fight had left scars, but it had also left a community willing to heal and grow together. And for the first time in a long time, Jamal didn't feel alone. He was part of something bigger now, something that had changed him and the people around him. The journey wasn't over, but it had started in a way he never could have imagined. As he looked up at the sky, painted with the soft hues of dusk, he knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, he'd face it with the people who stood beside him. Together, they were stronger. And that was enough to keep moving forward.